They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I disagree. Mine was served under the 1,000 crystal chandeliers of the Charleston Founders Gala, on a silver platter of public humiliation, so absolute it became a local legend overnight. My husband, Richard, and my daughter-in-law, Chloe, planned to steal my life's work, my legacy, and my dignity. They thought I was a fool. They didn't know I was the one setting the table for their final pathetic feast. I'm so glad you're here to listen to my story. If you're watching this, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'd also love to know what city you're listening from, just so I know how far our story has traveled. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, to the quiet before the storm. Our home in Charleston's historic district was a masterpiece of Southern charm, a 3-story testament to 35 years of marriage and hard work. The air hung thick with the scent of jasmine from the garden and the faint, lingering aroma of whatever complex sauce I'd been developing in the kitchen. This house, much like my marriage, was my pride and joy, beautifully maintained, admired by all our friends, and a perfect stage for the life I thought I was living. My company, Thompson Events and Cuisine, wasn't just a business. It was my 4th child, born from a small loan and a book of my grandmother's recipes, and raised into an empire that catered to the city's elite. Richard handled the books and the handshaking, the business side of things, he'd say. But I was the brand. I was the magic. The unease started, as it so often does, at a simple family dinner. It was a Sunday evening, the kind where the setting sun casts long golden shadows through the bay windows of our formal dining room. My son, Mike, was laughing at a story Richard was telling, his face open and full of love. He was a good son, a brilliant financial lawyer with a heart as kind as his father's was, I thought, charming. Across from him, his wife, Chloe, sat with a perfect smile. She was beautiful, of course, but her eyes were always busy. They weren't just looking. They were assessing. They scanned the antique silver, the hand-painted wallpaper, the heavy damask curtains. "Evie, this is all just so breathtaking," she said, her voice dripping with honey. "Mike and I were just talking about the business. Its valuation must be astronomical these days." I felt a subtle chill, the same one I felt every time she turned a compliment into a calculation. Richard beamed, placing a possessive hand on my shoulder. "We've done well," he said, the we feeling more like a me. He then raised his glass of Pinot Noir. "A toast," he declared, his voice smooth as velvet. "To family, and to the empire we built." He looked at me when he said it, but his eyes had a glint of ownership, not partnership. It was a look I was starting to see more and more often. After they left, the silence in the grand house felt heavier than usual. The clinking of plates as I loaded the dishwasher was the only sound, a lonely percussion in a space meant for laughter and warmth. I stood at the sink, looking out at the perfectly manicured garden, and told myself I was being foolish. What was wrong with me? I had everything. A successful husband, a wonderful son, a beautiful home. Chloe was just ambitious. Was that such a crime? And Richard? Well, men like Richard enjoyed being the king of their castle. After 35 years, perhaps the fire of passion naturally cools into the quiet embers of companionship. That's what marriage becomes, I reasoned, a comfortable, predictable partnership. We were business partners, life partners. The romance of our youth had simply matured into something quieter. I scrubbed at a non-existent spot on a plate, the repetitive motion a way to silence the tiny traitorous voice in my head that whispered, "Is this all there is?" Later that night, as I was laying out my clothes for a menu tasting the next morning, Richard came into our bedroom, already loosening his tie. He smelled of expensive cologne and the wine from dinner. "Darling," he started, his tone light and breezy, "I have to fly out to Atlanta for a couple of days. Some potential investors are in town, and I need to woo them." He didn't look at me as he spoke, his attention focused on selecting a watch from the velvet-lined box on his dresser. Atlanta again. It was always Atlanta. His explanation was flawless, practiced, a smooth little story that should have been reassuring. But it felt hollow. He walked over and kissed my cheek. It was a dry, perfunctory gesture, a checkmark on a list of husbandly duties. "Don't wait up," he said, before disappearing into his dressing room. I stood alone in the quiet opulence of our bedroom, the scent of his cologne hanging in the air like a question. I smoothed the silk of my blouse, my fingers tracing the embroidered pattern, and felt a profound sense of dread settle deep in my bones. The gilded cage had never felt so cold or so empty. And I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that a door had just been unlocked, and I was about to find out what was on the other side. That feeling of unease from Sunday dinner had lingered, not like a splinter, but like a single sour note in a perfectly composed symphony. A dissonance my soul couldn't ignore. I threw myself into my work, my sanctuary. My office, overlooking a quiet Charleston side street, smelled of old books and fresh-cut flowers. It was a space where my vision was law. With a strong cup of coffee steaming beside me, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years: a deep dive into the company's quarterly financials myself. Richard always presented me with a tidy summary, a top-line overview, he'd call it. But I felt a sudden, sharp need to see the machine, not just the polished product. I quickly found it, tucked under operational consulting, a recurring monthly payment for $20,000 to a company I'd never heard of, Apex Logistics and Growth Partners. It was perfectly corporate, perfectly vague, and perfectly unfamiliar. A cold knot started to form in my stomach as I searched my emails and files. Nothing. The phone number on the generic invoice went to a robotic, unnamed voicemail. My hand was trembling slightly as I picked up my cell phone and called Richard in Atlanta. "Evie, to what do I owe the pleasure?" he answered cheerfully. I kept my voice light. "Everything's fine, darling. Just a quick question about an invoice from Apex Logistics." There was a fractional pause. "Oh, that," he said with a dismissive little laugh. "That's just some back-end strategy stuff for the expansion. Honestly, it's dreadfully boring. Don't you worry your pretty head about it, darling. Leave the boring stuff to me. Don't you worry your pretty head about it." The phrase hit me like a slap. It was his go-to line, a verbal pat on the head, a wall. The friendly advice was a command: "Stay out." I ended the call with a hollow, "Of course, dear," and the command had the opposite effect. That night, sleep was a million miles away. I got up and walked into our enormous walk-in closet. Deciding to get a head start on packing for an anniversary trip, I pulled his leather dop kit from the shelf. I unzipped it, and as my fingers brushed against the silk lining of a side pocket, they closed around something small and plastic. I pulled it out. It was a tube of personal lubricant. An expensive artisanal brand, the kind for a passionate, novel affair, not for the gentle, comfortable rhythm our marriage had settled into. The two anomalies, the Phantom Company and this small, silent tube, collided in my mind with the force of a car crash. The constant trips to Atlanta. The dismissive tone on the phone. It wasn't just one crack anymore. A fissure had ripped through the foundation of my life. I was being lied to. And I knew, with a certainty that stole the breath from my lungs, that the betrayal was far bigger and far uglier than a simple, sordid affair. Richard wasn't just cheating on me. He was doing it with my money, my legacy, my empire, and I had no idea how deep the rot went. The next morning, I called Mike. I asked him to meet me for coffee at a small cafe near his law firm, a quiet place with ivy-covered walls where we could talk without being overheard. I arrived first, choosing a secluded table in the corner. When he walked in, his face lit up with a warm smile, but it faltered when he saw my expression. He kissed my cheek, his brow furrowed with concern. "Mom? What is it? You sound—" He trailed off, searching for the word. "Urgent," I supplied, my voice steadier than I felt. I waited until the server had placed our coffees on the table before I spoke. I laid out the facts as calmly and clinically as I could, like a surgeon describing a tumor. I told him about the Apex invoices, the $20,000 monthly payments, the dead-end phone number, and Richard's breezy, condescending dismissal. I presented it as a business problem, a financial anomaly that worried me. But I couldn't bring myself to mention the tube of lubricant. To say that part out loud would make it real, a sordid confession I wasn't ready to voice, especially not to my son. I needed to protect him, and maybe myself, from that specific humiliation for as long as I could. Mike listened intently, his lawyer's mind processing every detail. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by a sharp protective focus. A shell corporation, he murmured, shaking his head. Mom, are you sure? I just looked at him, and he saw the answer in my tired eyes. Okay, he said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. His was warm and strong. Okay. Don't you worry. I'll handle this. I'll use the firm's resources to do a deep dive on this Apex company. I'll be discreet. Dad will never know. It's probably just a vendor who's overcharging, some sloppy bookkeeping. We'll get to the bottom of it. He was trying to reassure me, to offer up a logical, less painful explanation. But we both knew this was more than that. The crack in our family's foundation was starting to spiderweb, and the ground beneath our feet felt unsteady. That night, Mike sat in his corner office on the 40th floor, the city of Charleston a glittering, indifferent tapestry below. He had told Chloe he was working late on a big merger, a lie that tasted like ash in his mouth. The investigation had started simply. A corporate search confirmed his initial fear. Apex Logistics and Growth Partners was a shell, incorporated 6 months prior with a P.O. box and a strip mall as its address. A classic ghost company. His stomach churned. At best, his father was being profoundly stupid or scammed. At worst, he didn't let his mind go there yet. He had to follow the money. Using a contact at the bank, citing potential corporate fraud, he got access to the Apex account history. The money trail was clear. Every month, a $20,000 transfer came in from Thompson Events and Cuisine, and within 48 hours, it was wired out to a high-limit credit card account. This was it. This card would tell the story. He pulled up the statements, his heart pounding a heavy, fearful rhythm. He steeled himself to see the evidence of a cliché midlife crisis: lavish dinners for two, charges from jewelry stores, lingerie boutiques. He was expecting to uncover a mistress. The statement loaded on his screen. The first charge he saw was from a 5-star hotel in Atlanta, dated 3 weeks ago, the exact dates of his father's last business trip. He felt a grim, hollow sense of confirmation. Then his eyes scanned down the list. He saw a charge for $2,800 from a designer boutique on King Street. He froze. Chloe had just bought a dress from that exact store, a stunning emerald green one she'd worn to a benefit last week. He teased her about the cost. A coincidence, he told himself, his mouth suddenly dry. It had to be. He kept scrolling. A charge for a couple's massage at a luxury spa on Kiowa Island. He and Chloe had talked about going there for her birthday. Another coincidence? The roaring in his ears was back, louder this time. Then he saw it. The charge that shattered the world. An airline ticket. Delta Airlines, round trip to Atlanta. The date of departure was the same day his father had left on his trip. With a shaking hand, he clicked to view the transaction details. He prayed to a god he barely believed in to see an unfamiliar name, some stranger, anyone. But the name on the ticket, illuminated in cold, blue pixels on his screen, was Chloe Thompson. His wife. The air in his office suddenly felt thin, unbreathable. He pushed his chair back from the desk, a strangled sound escaping his lips. His mind reeled, replaying the last few months in a sickening high-speed montage. Chloe's sudden collection of expensive handbags. Her vague excuses about girls' weekends that lined up perfectly with his father's business trips. the way she'd started acting distant, secretive with her phone. It was all there, a constellation of lies he had been too blind, too trusting to see. His father and his wife. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. He felt a violent urge to be sick. But the abyss had one more level. His contacts sent over one last file, an email chain found during a background search on the Apex principals. It was from his father's work account, forwarded to Chloe's personal email. The subject line was the final step. Attached were drafts of new corporate bylaws for Thompson Events and Cuisine. He forced his eyes to read the legal jargon. It was an aggressive, hostile takeover, written on his mother's own company letterhead. The documents would grant Richard sole fiduciary control and majority ownership, citing Evie's diminished capacity and desire to retire, a vicious, calculated lie. They were going to strip his mother of everything she had ever built. This wasn't a passionate affair. This was a conspiracy. A long, cold, methodical plan to destroy his mother and plunder her empire. Mike slumped in his chair, the city lights blurring into a meaningless smear of color. He looked at the two documents he'd printed out, Chloe's plane ticket and the first page of the fraudulent contract. Betrayal, deceit, greed. These were just words he used in a courtroom. He never imagined they would be the words that define his own family. The weight of his discovery was crushing. He was no longer just a son worried about his mother's business. He was the sole guardian of a truth so toxic it would burn their entire world to the ground. And he had to be the one to light the match. Mike called me just after 11 that night. I was in the kitchen, nursing a cup of chamomile tea I couldn't taste, staring out at the dark, manicured lawn. The house was a tomb. Richard wasn't due back from Atlanta until the next afternoon. I answered on the first ring. "Mom?" Mike's voice was a ghost of itself, thin, cracked, and hollowed out. "Can I come over? We need to talk. Now. In person." It wasn't a request. A cold red, sharper and more potent than anything I'd felt before, washed over me. This was it. This was the abyss. "I'll leave the side door unlocked," I whispered, and the line went dead. 20 minutes later, he walked into the kitchen. He looked like a stranger in his own life. His expensive suit was rumpled, his tie was gone, and his face was pale and drawn, aged a decade in a single day. He didn't say hello. He couldn't meet my eyes. He walked to the vast marble island that served as the heart of our home, and placed a thin manila folder on the cool white surface. The sound was a quiet, definitive thud in the silence. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I didn't want to open it. I knew that whatever was inside that folder would be the end of the world I knew. But I had to. My hands were steady as I opened the clasp. Inside were 3 pieces of paper. The first was a printout of an airline ticket. The name on it was Chloe Thompson. The second was a credit card statement, a litany of luxurious secret sins paid for by my company. The third was a draft of a contract, the letterhead of Thompson Events and Cuisine, stark and official. I didn't need to read the whole thing. My eyes caught the phrases: sole fiduciary control, transfer of majority ownership, Evelyn Thompson's desire to retire. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A strange glacial calm settled over me. The roaring in my ears stopped, and all was quiet. I looked up from the papers, the evidence of my life's demolition, and finally met my son's eyes. And in them, I saw it all. Not just his agony for me, but the profound personal devastation of a husband betrayed. It was as if our entire family legacy, the company, the name, had been declared bankrupt in a single devastating moment, and we were the sole heirs to a debt of shame. My husband, his wife. The pain was so immense, so complete, that it was beyond tears. It was a suffocating vacuum. I reached out and put my hand over his. We just stood there for a long time in the bright, sterile light of my kitchen, a mother and son shipwrecked on the same desolate shore. Finally, I broke the silence. My voice was a rasp. "The lubricant," I said, the words tasting like poison. "I found a tube of lubricant in your father's travel bag." Mike closed his eyes, a flicker of pain crossing his face. The final, sorted piece had just clicked into place for him. He nodded slowly. "They were together," he choked out. "Every trip. Every time." I withdrew my hand and walked from the kitchen into the living room. The room was a museum of my life, filled with artifacts of a happiness that I now knew was a lie. My eyes landed on the grand mantelpiece, on a heavy, ornate silver frame holding a photograph from Mike and Chloe's wedding day 4 years ago. The four of us stood smiling under a canopy of white roses. Chloe, radiant in her dress, holding Mike's arm. Me, beaming with pride. And Richard, standing behind me, his hands on my shoulders, the very picture of the proud patriarch. I picked up the heavy frame, the cold silver shock against my skin. I stared at the smiling faces, at the four strangers trapped in that perfect sun-drenched moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I turned the photograph face down on the mantel. The sound was a soft, muffled thump. An ending. When I turned back to face my son, the grief in my chest had not vanished, but something else was rising through it, something hard and cold and heavy. It was the businesswoman. It was the woman who had fought off suppliers and bankers and competitors for 30 years. It was rage forged into steel. I walked back to the kitchen island, picked up the fraudulent contract, and held it between two fingers as if it were contaminated. "This document," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "This is their script. A pathetic little play where I fade away and they take a bow. They've written me the role of a ghost in my own life." Mike looked at me, his voice raw. "Mom, what do we do?" My eyes narrowed, a cold fire igniting within them. I let the paper drop back to the counter. "We give them their stage. We'll provide the lights, the audience, the entire production. But they've forgotten one crucial detail." "What?" Mike asked. My voice dropped to a chilling, confident whisper. "I'm the one who directs the show." The next afternoon, the performance began. When Richard walked through the door, tanned from the Georgia sun, I greeted him with a warm smile and a kiss that felt like pressing my lips to cold stone. "Welcome home, darling," I said, my voice a perfect imitation of a loving wife. "Did you have a successful trip?" He launched into a detailed, fictional account of his meetings with the non-existent investors, and I listened, nodding and asking all the right questions, a knot of ice tightening in my stomach with every lie. That night, I cooked his favorite meal: pan-seared scallops with a saffron risotto. The aroma filled the house, a ghost of happier times. As I moved around the kitchen, my actions were fluid and familiar, but my mind was a fortress of cold, clear calculation. I was an actress giving the performance of a lifetime, and the stage was my own home. Richard, emboldened by my placid, welcoming demeanor, saw his opening. Over dinner, he reached across the table and took my hand. His touch felt alien, a spider crawling on my skin, but I didn't flinch. "Evie," he began, his voice laced with false sincerity, "we need to talk about the future. About our legacy." He then pitched his poison as if it were a love song. He spoke of wanting to lessen my burden, of allowing me to focus on the creative side, while he handled the stressful corporate structures. He presented the new partnership agreement, the very one I'd seen in Mike's folder, as a grand romantic gesture to secure our future. "I was thinking," he said, squeezing my hand, "we could sign the final papers on the night of the Founders' Gala. In front of everyone. A symbolic passing of the torch, from one era of our lives to the next." The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it almost made me laugh. He was handing me the perfect stage for his own public execution. I looked at him, my eyes wide with manufactured adoration. "Richard, that's the most romantic thing you've said in years," I replied, my voice catching with a perfect fake sob. "It's a wonderful idea." While I was playing the part of the devoted wife, the air in Mike and Chloe's home had thinned, each room a vacuum where affection used to be. They were just two strangers orbiting the silent, massive gravity of his wife's deceit. Chloe, utterly oblivious, chattered on about the gala, her dress, the guest list, the importance of making a good impression. "This is our year, Mikey," she said one evening, running a hand up his arm as he stared blankly at his laptop. "After the gala, once your dad finalizes the new structure, we can finally start living the life we deserve." Mike just stiffened, pulling his arm away. "I have work to do, Chloe," he said, his voice flat and dead. Every word from her mouth was fuel for the icy rage that was now his constant companion. Late at night, long after she had gone to sleep, he would retreat to his home office. The only sound would be the quiet click of his keyboard as he drafted the documents that would incinerate his own life: the petition for divorce on grounds of adultery, and the multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Richard and Chloe Thompson for conspiracy and fraud. Each typed word was a nail in the coffin of the man he used to be. My own preparations were more tangible. I spent hours online, diving into the obscure world of theatrical special effects. I found what I was looking for on a website that supplied materials to Hollywood movie sets: a professional-grade cosmetic adhesive. The description was perfect. It was a silicone-based pressure-sensitive glue used to apply heavy prosthetics. It was skin-safe, waterproof, and designed to create a bond that could last for hours under hot studio lights. Crucially, it was also crystal clear, with the exact same viscosity as the lubricant in Richard's DOP kit. I ordered a large tube, paying with a prepaid credit card, and having it shipped to a P.O. box I'd opened under a name I hadn't used since before I was married. When it arrived, the tube felt heavy and dangerous in my hand, a vial of pure concentrated consequence. The day before the gala, my moment came. Richard was in the shower, his booming off-key singing echoing through our suite. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my hands were as steady as a surgeon's. I walked into the master bathroom, the air thick with steam. His leather DOP kit was sitting on the marble vanity. I took out the tube of lubricant. In the privacy of my own dressing room, I performed the switch. I carefully squeezed the entire contents of the lubricant into a disposable container. Then, with painstaking precision, I refilled the original tube with the thick, clear cosmetic adhesive. I screwed the cap on, wiped away any residue with an alcohol swab, and polished the tube until it shone. It was perfect, indistinguishable. I walked back into the steamy bathroom and placed the tube back in its silk-lined pocket, nestling it into place as if it belonged there. The trap was now set. Every piece was in its place. I looked at my reflection in the fogged-up mirror. My face was calm, my expression unreadable. I could hear the water in the shower shut off. The show was about to begin. The ballroom of the Charleston Grand Hotel was a galaxy of glittering crystal and old money. A string quartet played softly in the corner, its melody a tasteful undercurrent to the murmur of 100 conversations. As the host of the annual Founders Gala, I stood at the entrance, a queen receiving her court. I wore a gown of deep sapphire silk, my posture regal, my smile gracious. Mike was by my side, impossibly handsome in his tuxedo, his face a stoic, unreadable mask. To the world, we were the picture of Southern grace and power, the architects of this flawless evening. But beneath the surface, we were predators, perfectly still, waiting for the precise moment to strike. Every clink of a champagne flute, every burst of polite laughter, was a tick of the clock counting down to the detonation of my husband's life. An hour into the event, the whispers began. "Evie, darling, where is Richard hiding?" asked a society doyenne, her diamonds flashing. I placed a hand on her arm, my face a perfect mask of wifely exasperation. "Oh, you know Richard," I sighed, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "He loves to make a grand entrance. He and Chloe are probably upstairs in the suite, taking their sweet time." I pulled out my phone and performed my next move, texting him for all to see. "Darling, where are you? The mayor is asking for you. Everyone is." Of course, there was no reply. Upstairs, in the presidential suite that my company had paid for, the main event had already begun. The bottle of Dom Perignon sat half empty on the nightstand, two flutes beside it. Chloe's emerald green gown was laid out on the chaise lounge like a promise. Richard, already in his tuxedo shirt, had retrieved the tube from his dop kit. "A little celebration," he murmured to Chloe, his voice thick with anticipation, "before we go downstairs and claim our kingdom." The trap, baited with their own arrogance and greed, had been sprung. They wouldn't know its teeth were made of steel until it was far too late. Downstairs, another 30 minutes crawled by. The whispers grew louder. The performance of my life escalated. I found the hotel manager, my voice trembling with expertly feigned concern. "Mr. Davies," I said, clutching his arm. "I'm getting terribly worried. Richard isn't answering his phone. He has a minor heart condition," I lied, the vicious little detail designed to add urgency and override any privacy concerns. "I'm afraid something might have happened. Could you please send security up to our suite just to check on them?" The manager's face paled. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson. Right away." The next 10 minutes were the longest of my life. I stood talking to a potential client, discussing a summer wedding menu, my voice never wavering. But my entire being was focused on the grand double doors at the far end of the ballroom. Then it happened. The doors didn't open. They burst apart, slammed against the walls by two grim-faced paramedics. The string quartet faltered, a single violin screeching into the sudden, shocked silence. The crowd turned as one. It wasn't Richard and Chloe, poised for their grand entrance. It was a single gurney, being wheeled with urgent, clattering speed across the polished marble floor. On the gurney were two figures, entangled beneath a single, thin white hospital sheet. But the sheet could not hide the truth. It was pulled taut in a way that left nothing to the imagination, outlining two bodies fused together in a grotesque, intimate tangle. A woman's slender bare leg was hooked over a man's, an emerald green designer heel dangling from her foot by a single strap. A man's arm was thrown over her, an expensive gold watch gleaming on his wrist. A collective gasp sucked the air from the ballroom. It was followed by a sound I will never forget, a tidal wave of whispers, of scandalized murmurs, of horrified, morbid delight. "Is that? My God, it's Richard Thompson. And is that Mike's wife? Are they stuck?" The whispers turned to gasps as the gurney passed under a chandelier, illuminating the pained crimson faces of Richard and Chloe, twisted in a rictus of agony and absolute humiliation. I could smell it then, the faint chemical odor of the solvent the paramedics must have used, mingling with the scent of the sea base and champagne my company had served. It was the smell of my victory. I watched the flashes of the cameras reflecting in the crystal glasses, each pop a punctuation mark at the end of their story. The story I had written for them. Through it all, I stood perfectly still, my hand flying to my mouth in a gesture of flawless shock. My eyes, however, were clear and cold. Across the sea of horrified faces, I met Mike's gaze. He stood like a statue, his face ashen, but his eyes were blazing. He gave me a single, sharp nod, so small no one else would have seen it. Checkmate. The drive home was silent. The adrenaline of the night had evaporated, leaving a heavy, hollow quiet in the car. The glittering lights of Charleston blurred past the windows, oblivious. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. We had won, but the victory sat between us, cold and heavy as a tombstone. By the time I returned to my house, the digital firestorm was already a Category 5 hurricane. The #number Gailagate was trending nationally. Blurry cell phone videos of the gurney were already viral. The narrative was set. The philandering husband, the treacherous daughter-in-law, and the dignified wronged wife. Their social execution was swift, brutal, and absolute. At the hospital, under the harsh, unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights, the physical reckoning was just as grim. A team of doctors, after a long and excruciatingly undignified procedure, had finally managed to separate them. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a silence more damning than any accusation. In that sterile white room, the truth of their ruin was no longer a thought, but a physical presence, a third person standing beside their beds. Then, the door to their room opened. It was Mike. He was dressed in a simple dark gray suit, his face carved from stone. Beside him stood a process server. Chloe was the first to see him, her voice a desperate broken sob. "Mikey. Oh, God, Mikey, I am so sorry. Please, just let me explain." Mike didn't even glance at her. He walked slowly, deliberately, to her bedside. His eyes flicked down for a single deliberate beat to the simple gold wedding band on his finger. Then, his gaze lifted back to her face, now completely empty of any recognition or emotion. He pulled the ring from his finger and placed it on the sterile metal of her bedside table. The quiet click it made was as final as a gunshot. The process server stepped forward. "Chloe Thompson," he said, his voice devoid of emotion as he placed a thick envelope on her lap. "You have been served." He then turned to Richard, whose face was a mask of disbelief. "Richard Thompson. You have been served." Richard stammered, "Son, please, don't do this. We can fix this. This is your family." For the first time, Mike moved his eyes. He looked at his father. The look wasn't one of anger or of sadness. It was one of complete and utter finality, the look one gives to a stranger they never wish to see again. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence was his answer. It said everything. "You are not my father. This is not my family. We are done." Chloe's sobs turned into desperate, ugly wails. Richard just stared, the reality of the documents, the lawsuit for fraud and conspiracy, the irrefutable end of his marriage, and his fortune finally sinking in. Mike turned his back on the wreckage and walked out of the room, closing the door behind him. Back in my kitchen, as the first rays of dawn began to pierce the darkness, my phone buzzed on the counter. I picked it up. It was a single text from Mike. It had only one word: "Done." I switched the phone off and walked to the large bay window in my living room. The sun was rising, casting a soft golden light over my garden. I felt a pang of grief, a final, faint echo of the life I had lost. But as the sun climbed higher, the grief was replaced by a profound, quiet calm. It wasn't the giddy feeling of victory. It was the sober relief of justice. The reckoning was complete. My legacy was safe. The war was over. And I had won. 6 months can feel like a lifetime. The gala incident became a permanent fixture in the Charleston social lexicon, a new ghost story to be whispered over mint juleps on historic verandas, a cautionary tale for ambitious wives and arrogant husbands. The name Thompson was no longer synonymous with shame. It was becoming synonymous with resilience. My resilience. The first thing I did was tear the old sign down. Thompson Events and Cuisine was a name built on a partnership that was a lie. In its place, a new sign of brushed gold letters went up: Evelyn & Co. Culinary Design. It was my name, my vision, my company. Mine alone. The business didn't just survive, it thrived. Our story, ironically, had made us the talk of the town in a new way. Clients, mostly women, flocked to us, drawn to the unspoken narrative of a woman who had refused to be broken. Our kitchen, once a place of tense, unspoken secrets, was now filled with light and laughter. I was more inspired than I had been in years, creating new menus, pushing culinary boundaries, and falling in love with my work all over again. Mike was the other half of that rebirth. He had settled his affairs, leaving his law firm behind to become my official managing partner. He brought a lawyer's sharp mind and a son's fierce loyalty to the business, streamlining operations and securing contracts bigger than any Richard had ever managed. He was brilliant, and seeing him in his element, fighting for our legacy, was the greatest joy of my life. One bright Monday morning, he walked into my newly renovated office, a space now decorated in light creams and blues, holding 2 cups of coffee. "The grand hotel contract is signed," he said, a genuine, easy smile on his face. It was a smile I hadn't seen in years, and it was like watching the sun rise. "They want to make us their exclusive event partner." I took the coffee, my heart swelling with a pride that was pure and uncomplicated. "That's wonderful, Mike," I said. We stood for a moment in comfortable silence, the energetic buzz of our company a living thing around us. "The final papers from your father's lawyers came this morning," I said quietly. "It's all settled. They took the offer. They won't fight the lawsuit." Mike just nodded. We had been generous, offering them a small lump sum in exchange for them vanishing from our lives forever. They had taken it. The last I'd heard, Richard and Chloe had moved somewhere to the Midwest, disgraced and exiled, 2 ghosts haunting someone else's town. They were a chapter of my life that was now, finally, closed. "Mom," Mike said, turning to face me. "Are you okay?" I looked at my son, at the man he had become. The wound was still there, I knew. A betrayal that deep leaves scars on the soul. But his eyes were clear, his shoulders were straight. He was healing. He was whole. "I am," I said, and the words were true. "I'm more than okay." He put his arm around my shoulder, and we stood together, looking out the large window that overlooked the city. "What do you think about expanding to Savannah?" he asked, a playful, ambitious glint in his eye. I laughed, a real, full-throated laugh that came from deep within. The sound was liberating. It was the sound of a future that was ours to write. The foundation of my life had been built on a lie, and it had crumbled into dust. But a foundation is just the beginning. It's what you build on top of it that matters. And here, in the light of a new day, with my son by my side, we were laying the first stones of something real, something true. Something that would last. For many of us, life is a beautiful structure we spend decades building. We lay a foundation of marriage, raise our children, and pour our souls into our work, creating a legacy we hope will stand the test of time. We find comfort in the familiar rhythms of a long-term partnership, believing the walls around us are strong and secure. But as my story shows, sometimes the life we think we have is just a beautiful illusion, and the person sleeping beside us can become a stranger. The deepest lesson here isn't about the pain of betrayal, as real as that is. It's about what happens after the collapse. It's about standing in the rubble of the life you knew and realizing that your true foundation was never another person. It was always your own resilience, your own character, and your own strength. The things we create with our own hands and hearts, whether it's a business or the love we pour into our children, can never truly be taken from us. They are the core of who we are. This story is a testament to the fact that it is never too late to reclaim your life and rewrite your ending. Sometimes, the most honest and hopeful chapter begins the day you decide to stop mourning what was and start building what can be. The love that remains, the authentic, unbreakable bond like the one I have with my son, becomes the light that guides you as you build something new, something stronger, something that is truly yours. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It wasn't an easy one to tell, but it's mine. If my journey meant something to you, I would be so grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let's meet in the comments. I'm looking forward to reading your thoughts. Wishing you peace and strength on your own journey.